Now to our top story, Egypt on the edge now in spite of nationwide curfews. Thousands of protesters are still in Cairo's central Tahrir Square right now. They are chanting for President Hosni Mubarak to leave the country, leave office immediately. This just an hour after the Egyptian president appeared on state television saying that he is not going to run for re-election in September, saying instead that he will stay on through the rest of his term, which ends in September. We find out the effects of the situation are being felt politically and economically throughout the region and the world. We've got a Taking Stock think tank now to react and analyze this. Jonathan Schanzer is from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's also a former terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Treasury Department. Also with us, David Keyes, director of cyberdissidents.org. Jonathan, David, good to have you with us. David, if you would just set the stage a little bit, you heard President Mubarak coming out and saying that he will not run for re-election, but that he's going to stay on until September. Is this going to be enough to satisfy the demands of the hundreds of thousands of people who are currently in the streets throughout Egypt?
I think that Mubarak's latest statement won't placate most of the Egyptians, at least that I speak to. There's over 1 million Egyptians right now gathering in what's aptly named Liberation Square, shouting "Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam," which means the people want the end of the regime. They know that Mubarak has just appointed his first vice president in 30 years of power, but even that did not placate their demands. They're angry and they want change immediately.
Jonathan Schanzer, do you agree?
I agree, and I actually think that it would be against U.S. interest if Mubarak were to stay in power until those elections in September. And the main reason is that if he leaves at that time, it will only allow for the other political parties, the secular parties, those that would be in contest with the Muslim Brotherhood. It would only give them about 8 or 9 months to prepare for that election. I think they would lose that election to the Brotherhood, at which point we would see an Islamist state emerge in Egypt, which of course would probably prompt Western countries to ask for another dictator to come in to quell the situation.
David, what about this notion that the other parties who are protesting in the streets, the secular parties, would not have a chance to really formulate themselves and put together a platform, and that the Muslim Brotherhood would come out the big winner in elections in September?
There's a great fear in the West, of course, about the Muslim Brotherhood because they are so extremist. But the point that a lot of people have been saying about Egypt is that support of a so-called secular dictator, a so-called secular leader, and a so-called stable leader has in fact increased the radicalism in Egypt. Egypt is an impoverished, illiterate, dysfunctional state, and if you want to increase the chances that people will be attracted to the radical parties, you can keep on supporting a dictator who has destroyed Egypt.
Jonathan Schanzer, what then should the United States do? Should they try to push President Mubarak out of office now?
Well, they need to do it in an orderly fashion. And what I propose with my colleague Khairi Abaza at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies is that we see a transition period that would be presided over by the Egyptian military. This is the same Egyptian military that we've been providing billions of dollars of aid to over the years, so there's a certain amount of trust. We ask the military to preside over this period, which would last probably a year or two, where there would be a caretaker government, whether it would be Omar Suleiman, the vice president that was just installed, or perhaps even Mohammed al-Baradei, the former IAE inspector. During that time, we would want to see the writing of a new constitution and then a move to elections. The nice thing about this plan is that it was actually proposed by the Waft Party, a secular party in Egypt back in the 1980s. So this would not be the U.S. imposing its will on the Egyptian people, but rather suggesting something that has already been out in the public space. This is what we're recommending right now.
David Keyes, what about the dismantling of the security apparatus that has kept a lid on expression, political expression, social expression inside of Egypt? Is that part of the protesters' demands?
Absolutely. There are some things that unify almost all the protesters. One is corruption of the regime, and the other is the despotic nature of the regime. Some of the bloggers we're very close with, including one named Karim Amr, who spent the last 4 years in prison for insulting the Egyptian dictator on his blog, are calling for simple demands: more openness, more freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And I think after the tens of billions of dollars that the United States has given to Egypt in past decades, these are among the most base demands that can be met.
What about those who have been imprisoned in Egypt or have been detained because of their political views?
Egypt is famous for detaining people with different political opinions, and a number of prisons have seen prison breaks even, and this is a whole new world. It's unprecedented in Egyptian history to have such a dramatic change. There's a lot of people calling for change, and we hope that it will become stable and more prosperous and open in the future.
All right. David Keyes, the internet, mobile phone service, all blocked by the Mubarak government. What has the effect been on the revolution, on the turmoil in the streets?
Well, in one sense, it's been devastating. Most of the Egyptians that we speak with over the internet summarily disappeared in one fell swoop. So they're having more difficulty coordinating with each other, but at the same time, there's over 1 million people in the streets of Cairo, and that's without any internet whatsoever. So it's clearly been transferred from the screens to the streets. But that said, I think the fact that Egypt cut off the internet in totality signifies its incredible fear and insecurity at this pivotal moment in Egyptian history. There are those who say that dictators like the internet because they can censor, they can follow, they can track. But in the final analysis, if Mubarak liked the internet, he wouldn't have shut it off as millions were marching in the streets.
Jonathan Schanzer, shouts coming from Tahrir Square in central Cairo from the protesters against President Hosni Mubarak saying, "Get out, get out." Is it possible that he will rethink his message to the Egyptian people?
I think it's quite possible. Obviously, the message that he's hearing loud and clear is that didn't go far enough. If you've been listening to what the protesters have been asking for over the last 8 days, it is nothing short of having this regime end, having Mubarak step down. And this has been the demands that have been put forth by a coalition of opposition leaders led by Mohammed al-Baradei. And it was interesting, actually, in Mubarak's speech, he mentioned nothing about those opposition leaders and mentioned nothing about working with them. So it's as if he's trying to leave on his own terms and to give himself 8 months of calm before he steps out of office. But I don't believe that the people of Egypt are going to allow him that.
Jonathan, speak a little bit about the composition of the protest groups, because they are not just poor people, they are not just lower middle class, they seem to be drawn from every walk of life in the Egyptian society.
They are, and again, leading that coalition right now is a sort of a mysterious figure, Mohammed al-Baradei, who was at the IAEA for 2 decades. Also,
that's the United Nations Nuclear Agency.
Correct, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And it's interesting, he won a Nobel Prize in 2005, but also presided over the IAEA while Iran made its greatest strides in the nuclear program. So there's a lot of ambivalence about him here in the West. We're just not sure exactly whose side he's on, but the Egyptian people are drawn to him. He's probably one of their most famous political figures. He came back to Egypt about a year ago and started campaigning for liberalization. That message has resonated, and it's actually attracted the Muslim Brotherhood. They've formed a very unlikely coalition, as have other secular groups, and those are the people effectively who are out who are making these demands. But the protesters out on the streets, it's important to note, this is a leaderless protest. It's very difficult to tell who's in charge, and that's made it a little bit more difficult for the Mubarak regime to handle it.
David Keyes, what about the release of some of the bloggers, some of the people that had been detained? Are they likely to become the leaders of this movement? You heard what Jonathan was saying. This is something that is encompassing rich, poor, employed, unemployed, skilled, unskilled. It seems as though they're all looking for someone. Who's out there?
Well, this is one of the question marks. Mohammed al-Baradei is, of course, the most well-known among them. There are leaders among the Muslim Brotherhood who some are attracted to. And then there are some lesser-known leaders, including Ayman Noor, and there are questions surrounding his future. There's also people like Saadettin Ibrahim, and there are some people who may emerge from the rabble. But it's absolutely correct what you said. What we've heard from a number of people on the ground is that this is a broad swath of the Egyptian population. I know, having been in the Islamist slums of Cairo, how much hatred there was towards the regime. Whether you were wealthy or poor, there was an element of fear in everyday life. Proverbs like "the walls have ears" resonated on people's lips, and this is the upshot of decades of autocracy and corruption.
David, what about this as being an economic revolution? You spoke about how the country is impoverished, yet it seems as though at least you can point to various liberalization efforts on the part of the Mubarak regime in order to encourage more businesses to list on the exchange, try to attract foreign capital into the country. Has that not been successful?
It's been successful to a degree, and like all autocracies, it can grow for a period, but over the long run, it's generally unsustainable. Even the Soviet Union went through periods of growth. So Egypt has been attempting to appear more and more liberal, but it's very hard to hide the fact that when you imprison bloggers like Karim Amr merely for criticizing the government, it's hard to attract long-term serious investment when that's the reality on the ground and everyone knows it.
Jonathan Schanzer, industries such as agriculture and food, tourism, banking, as well as the energy business in Egypt. How much longer can they withstand the turmoil?
They can't. Specifically, the tourism industry is flatlining. You're hearing of thousands upon thousands of people who are canceling their trips to Egypt, and this is really the lifeblood of the economy, other than the tolls exacted from shipping that goes through the Suez Canal, which is obviously vital that this stays open. So for that, I think the Egyptians can be thankful, and the rest of the world, quite frankly, can be thankful that the military is ensuring that that waterway remains open. But the rest of the economy has really ground to a halt. You're hearing about people who are in bread lines right now, frustrated families who can't even get food or clothing for their families. This is difficult right now, and it's hard. I mean, I guess that's the balance here that we're looking at. You've got a very angry group that's out in Tahrir Square protesting, and then you've got the average Egyptian that may be suffering.
All right, I want to thank you very much. Jonathan Schanzer joining us from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, David Keyes from cyberdissidents.org.